To close the conference off, we're going to welcome Richard Watson to the stage. Richard is a writer, a speaker and a strategist who helps organisations to think ahead, and he's going to talk to us for half an hour or so about how the digital age is changing the way we work and why we should be worried about it. Please welcome Richard Watson.
Oops, hang on. Thank you. A while ago, I met a marketing director at a food company in Melbourne. She was in her 40s, and she was telling me about a conversation she had with one of her employees who was in her 20s. And the 40-year-old was basically wondering why everyone left the office at precisely 5:30 p.m., regardless of what they were doing. And the 20-something answered, "Why are you so obsessed with the physical presence thing?" And I thought at the time that's quite an interesting comment. And I think what this means, if I do my work and I do it well, what's your problem? If I happen to do it at 1 o'clock in the morning on a laptop while lying naked in bed whilst watching old episodes of Law and Order, why is that a concern of yours? And I think clearly there's a difference of opinion here about the nature of, and more specifically, the location of work. And essentially what's going on is a sort of clash of attitudes about management and about the use of spaces. Generation X and baby boomer managers tend to subscribe to a rather old school view of work as being a bit like sort of school or possibly prison. People have to be physically present to be properly managed. This has been touched on quite a bit just earlier. And ideally, they should be in a single room full of identical desks with a manager, and it could be a teacher, it could be a prison warden. There's not a great deal of difference in my view. Taking a roll call to see if everyone is present and properly dressed. And then they'll walk around seeing whether everyone's behaving themselves. And God forbid anyone's having any fun. If there's physical movement, it's generally assumed that people are working. If there's not, if somebody's looking out of the window, it's assumed they're being highly unproductive or not paying attention. And I think this possibly stems from the historical idea that work was about brawn and not brains, and discipline and control were pretty much everything. And I think the formal organisational hierarchies we've been living with for about sort of 50 or 60 years have come out of that, and it's translated into large rooms full of identical desks, watched over by a large clock and someone in charge. Now, we've gone through different phases. We've had the small desk, the personal desk. We're currently gone to a sort of open plan situation at the moment, although in some instances I think we're sort of reverting back to the individual desk or a mix of the two, as which was touched on earlier on. Now, things have obviously changed. We've sort of moved into a post-information processing age, and it is now high time to rethink what work is, what it's for, where we do it. Critically, I think it's time to rethink how employees interact with each other. And the thing I'm the most interested in is how physical and virtual spaces influence the quality of people's thinking. And also, to some extent, how do physical objects impact the quality of thinking? Because it's really, these days, thinking where the competitive advantage and value lies. Organisations talk quite a bit, in my view, about the need for breakthrough thinking, dreadful terms like out-of-the-box thinking and blue sky thinking. Now, if they're going to do that, it strikes me that they're going to need to attract some smart people. And to attract smart people, they're going to have to create some environments that are stimulating, both physically and mentally, especially if the economy gets back on track and the demographics kick in. We are facing declining fertility rates in most nations, including the UK, and there is a significant power shift likely to occur towards the employee away from the employer. This is economy dependent, but let's just assume everything's looking quite good and we get to a reasonable level of growth. I think that's generally true. I think it's also important that organisations need to remember, or at least recognise, that it's people's thinking and ideas they're after. I mean, this was touched on earlier, and again, it's not their physical presence particularly that they're after, really. It's their thinking. Their ideas, their creativity, and so on. And to some extent, physical presence is unimportant, especially, if you're after these new ideas. The other thing that I'm going to touch on towards the end is I don't think ideas themselves like coming to work, but I'm going to come back to that. Now, before we go forwards, I think it's quite useful to go backwards. It's generally accepted that the modern office was invented around 1900. This is a relatively recent invention. And again, this has been touched on. The main reason for the development of the factory, which I think dates from maybe 100 years earlier, around about 1790, there was somebody called Eli Whitney who essentially created mass production techniques because the US government needed muskets. And it sort of slowly developed thereafter. And Henry Ford gets quite a lot of the credit for mass production and factories and offices, but actually a whole load of other people made some pretty vital contributions. Regardless of who started things, I think it was really World War I and World War II. So sort of, around the early part of last century and the middle part of last century, when governments needed large quantities of armaments again, that factory owners might need to house the exploding number of administrative workers. And to some extent, bingo, work as we know it and experience it today was born. But there's another reason for the creation of the office, which is closely linked to this, and that was the invention of a bit of new whiz-bang technology, the typewriter. Before 1868, typewriters didn't exist. There was no need to build rooms to house typists or administrative assistants. In 1874, Remington, another gun company, there's a bit of a theme here going on, I don't know if you're picking this out, perfected the manual typewriter. And even then, though, demand for office assistants and typists was relatively small. You had Olivetti introducing the electric typewriter in the 20s, but demand was still relatively modest. There just wasn't very much to type. And if there wasn't much to type, there wasn't much point in having a meeting, and there wasn't much point in doing any filing. And I suppose this change, it's debatable, but roughly in the sort of early 50s or 60s, when consumerism, global markets, information processing really took off, and things, as has been touched on yet again, are changing really quite radically now. And one of the problems we do face is that we have all this new technologies, but as was said earlier, we're grafting it onto old physical spaces and old attitudes and beliefs and so on. And I suppose what's really driving things is fundamentally digitalization, and particularly the spin-offs from this, things like mobile connectivity and virtualization. So is one type of work or one sort of model of work any better than the other? Does physical presence actually fundamentally matter? And if it doesn't, how on earth do you successfully manage a workforce that isn't there, a virtual workforce? Moreover, does it really matter where the thinking itself occurs? Should thinking be a solitary activity, or is it true that none of us is ever as smart as all of us? In short, is the Generation X manager right, or is it the Generation Y employee that's right? Well, I think they're both right, and of course they're both equally wrong. Globalization, digitalization, mobile connectivity, virtualization, we're about to get customer service avatars and holographic telepresence, which will make your eyes pop out. They are changing how we work in quite fundamental ways, and there are obviously risks and opportunities associated with this change. There's more flexibility in terms of when and where we work. If I want to do it in bed naked at 1 o'clock this morning, I don't really care. I don't think anyone else should really care to some extent. Collaboration is much easier, both locally and globally. And things can obviously be done much faster, but I think we have to be very careful about doing certain things much faster. On the other hand, a lack of physical presence, and perhaps much more importantly, a lack of mental presence, is having some nasty side effects. Now, I'm not really going to comment on the upside of digital culture. This is well covered by a bunch of other people. Suffice to say that the advantages probably outweigh the disadvantages, although I'm not totally sure about that. And, I am ultimately a fan of this stuff. I couldn't do half of what I do today without digital technology. There's not too much doubt about that. But there are some negatives. And I'd like to just quickly, because I haven't got a huge amount of time, just run through 5 of the potential problems and put forward some suggestions. So, what are some of the problems? Well, the first issue for me is that this culture of sort of immediacy and rapid response and multitasking has emerged. And it's spawning silly mistakes. It's spawning a whole lot of things, but it's one of the things it's spawning is silly mistakes, or what I call constant partial stupidity. And I am as guilty of this as anybody. I read emails too fast. I don't see the PS at the bottom, which is about a change of time or location. I receive lots of emails and I start replying to them, and then I get a bunch of other emails, so I stick them in my drafts folder. In my drafts folder at the moment, there are 157 emails going back to June 2009. Now, you could argue, and you'd probably be right, that if something goes back to June 2009, it's probably not that important. And I suppose what's going on to some extent is my subconscious is taking over control of my desktop, which is probably quite a good thing. I get bank statements online now, not on paper, and I read them too fast and I miss mistakes. Or a classic, very recently, I got a text message from my 13-year-old nephew saying, "I love you." And I thought, oh, how sweet. And I texted him back saying, "I love you too." And then about 10 hours later, it suddenly dawned on me that that text message probably wasn't intended for me. It was probably intended for somebody else. A second related issue is I think that screens, and it's mobile screens in particular, are encouraging thinking that's rushed and devoid of content. Great statistic. 99% of Google searches do not proceed beyond page 1 of results. We opt for what's easiest, what's fastest, what's most convenient. And to some extent, we're moving in the direction of all using the same sources, which you could argue means we're all going to end up thinking the same thing, which is not exactly a great model for original thought. Online, we're in a hurry. We sometimes fall for falsehoods. We don't check things properly. A very famous example of this I wrote a little while ago was some students who were asked to look at a website featuring a rare tree octopus. 90% of the students thought it was a real animal. Thirdly, we relish constant communication and connection, but we're often forced to act without properly thinking things through, a bit like my text response. Mobile devices in particular demand instant answers. They scream at us to respond. And a business culture of quarterly or annual results and political cycles of 4 to 5 years are also doing much the same thing. It's shortening attention spans, but it's also shortening our thinking. There was a study by a Dutch university not so long ago that found that decisions are much more effective when we walk away from the problem for a while. And this chimes with very much how our brains work. More often than not, it's our subconscious that's doing our best thinking. And the expression sleeping on it actually does come from somewhere. It actually does mean something. The fourth point really is that, yes, we benefit from the ubiquity of instant communication, but it comes at quite a high cost. Constant digital interruptions and too much information are atomizing our attention and splintering our concentration. Constant connectivity via Facebook updates and Twitter streams, yes, they're giving us a sense of other people's lives, but on one level, it means we're sort of replacing intimacy with familiarity. You know, we know more people nowadays, but it seems to me we don't know them as well. And this is sort of borne out to some extent by some research, some sociologists at the University of Arizona and Duke University in North Carolina in the US. Rather surprisingly, they found that Americans have fewer real friends than they used to. This is kind of weird. It's sort of counterintuitive. You'd think the absolute opposite. If there are 800 million Facebook users out there, you'd think we'd have more friends, not less. I mean, they're talking about what they call deep friends, people you would actually turn to in a crisis, which is obviously something quite specific. Back in '85, the average American had 3 people to confide in about their deepest problems and fears. Now the figure is just 2. Digitalization has reduced the need for face-to-face contact, and ironically, one of the consequences of our connected age is an increase in isolation. Fifth and finally, we have more choice nowadays. Indeed, in many instances, if you don't want choice, you can't have it. I'll give you an example of that. My television at home, I only really want 4 channels. I'm forced to get about 50. There's nothing I can do about that. We're able to personalize more things too, particularly information, to some extent, people. But the downside of this, I think, is less serendipity and less understanding and empathy of others. If you're able to isolate yourself in a sort of personalized bubble of information and friends, where opposing opinions and people are sort of cut out, I think this is likely to lead to an increase in narcissism and a decrease in empathy. Moreover, online crowds, and there's some great thing about online crowds, really great thing about online crowds, but they're drowning out individual opinion, and particularly opinion that's somewhat eccentric or original. Peer pressure is effectively now networked and available 24/7. And this might not be too much of a problem if you're 30, 40 something, but if you're a 12-year-old, that pressure is really quite significant now. Now, that's a fair bit to worry about, but there's more. Generation Y are recognizable. You know, they're recognizably human. Okay, they've grown up with some pretty radical technology change. They're highly networked, they're highly collaborative. Some people think they're more ethical than other generations. I think that's disputable. But, you know, they are of the human species. If you go underneath generation, or the next generation after generation Y, which there seems to be an enormous amount of debate about what they're called, it strikes me as blindingly obvious what they're called if the previous one was Y and the one before that was X. But anyway, the Google generation, apparently. So I'm talking about people here that are 13 and younger, so relatively young people. And to be honest, we don't know too much about them yet because they're too damn young. But we are beginning to see some certain traits that are kind of interesting. This is the generation that prefers multitasking, parallel processing, interactive, personalized experiences. They have generally prefer images over words. They read text in a non-linear fashion. They sort of jump around like caffeinated rabbits. They don't just go down like most people. And they have seriously reduced attention spans. And I mean seriously reduced attention spans, which if you're involved in education is becoming quite a problem. I mean, books are just too long these days. And this youngest generation is really summed up by a couple of things. First, a newspaper in Australia a few years ago, and second, a conversation from last night. The letter in the newspaper was from a mother who had a 6-year-old, and the 6-year-old asked her whether bread should be put in a toaster, landscape, or portrait. I mentioned this to my 10-year-old, and he commented that the kid should have Googled it. Last night I did something. I was having a drink with some people, and there was a remark from a father who had asked his young daughter why she was always late and why she didn't wear a watch. And the young girl had no real answer to why she was always late. And I guess who cares if you're a young girl whether you're late or not. But in response to why she didn't wear a watch, the girl replied, "Why would I want to spend my money on a single function device?" She was 12. I think I should probably cease with the generational warfare. What can we do about some of this stuff? The first thing is, I think we need, and this is probably the absolutely key point I want to make. My first suggestion is we need to get off this sort of speed is good treadmill and deal with quite a deep fear that a slower pace will negatively impact productivity, even GDP ultimately. Slow thinking has got quite a few negative connotations, but if slow food is good and slow cities are good, I don't really see why slow thinking and slow media can't be good. My second thought, and this is possibly a wee bit controversial for people in the technology business, I think we need to switch some of our devices off from time to time, primarily so that our brains can relax. We can't be hyper-connected the entire time. We'll go nuts. And this is not a glib point. Our brains need rest and relaxation in the same way that our bodies need rest and relaxation. And if it doesn't happen, there are quite serious physical and mental consequences. By the way, it's quite interesting to me that, I don't know how many people here are parents with kids more than about 10 years old, but we seem to be sort of setting boundaries for our children's use of technology, but we don't set those or apply those boundaries to ourselves. And you see this with parents picking up kids from school that are on the phone. They're having a family dinner, they're on the phone. The classic example, or the example I'm most interested in, is if you went back to the dawn of time when I was a kid, the prams used to face the parent, and the parent would actually have some sort of interaction and conversation quite often with the child. Next time you see somebody pushing a pram, look at which way it's facing. It's facing away from the parent, and I would say there's a 50% chance or more the parent's on a phone. There is almost zero interaction between the parent and the child, and I don't know what the consequence of that's going to be, but I suspect it's not good. Third, and this is another critical one, we need to get away from this sort of rather old-fashioned idea that all information, to some extent all interruption, is good, that information is power. Any information is power. It isn't. We need to make the distinction between information that's essential and information that's ephemeral or inconsequential. And trust me, I would think at least 90% of all information interruption is completely inconsequential, hence my rather large draft book going back to 2009. The fourth point is we need to be patient, and that is extremely difficult in this sort of fast-paced, hyper-connected, get it done yesterday world. One of the biggest problems with big problems is that we give up too soon. You know, we're looking for a problem, we're looking for a solution, we don't find one, we give up. But ideas, I think they come about in three stages. The first is what I'd call the education phase. We find a problem, we look at it from different sides, we expose ourselves to varied inputs and so on. But then we actually need to forget about it. We need to forget about things. We need to mentally and physically relax and go and do something that's not directly related to the problem. And this is quite an awkward stage because it doesn't look like anything's going on. It doesn't feel like work. And at this stage, our subconscious takes over again, and it starts mixing things up. It starts, joining things together. And then when you're least expecting it, out pops an idea or solution. Although you can actually expect it, because I can more or less guarantee you, for the really big ideas and solutions, you are not sitting at a desk at work. And I'll come back to that. Fifth and final thing is, if we're after good ideas, I think we need to go where good ideas are going to find us. Now, I wrote this book a little while ago called Future Minds, which a lot of people thought was about sort of Gen Z or whatever you want to call them, and it's not really. It's about the future of thinking and particularly the future of ideas. And at one point, I was kind of struggling to get anywhere, and I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll go and talk to a load of people about where they did their best thinking. Interestingly, I didn't need to explain best thinking to anybody. Not a single person asked me what I meant. I think people instinctively knew it was something to do with sort of most profound, highest quality, most productive, and so on and so forth. And I eventually spoke to and got responses from exactly 1,000 people. And this is all ages, all genders, all geographies, all professions. Out of 1,000 people, only one person said, at work. And they didn't mean it. They were lying their socks off. Because what they actually said was, really, really early in the morning, when there's nobody else around in the office, which strikes me as not really a functioning office. You could be doing that kind of thing absolutely anywhere. I haven't got time to go into the individual responses as to where people do their best thinking, but suffice to say that quite a lot of it is exactly what you'd expect. It's in the bath, it's in the shower, it's staggeringly early in the morning in bed when you wake up, it's when you've got jet lag, it's staring out of a window going to New York halfway through a gin and tonic, it's walking on a beach, it's halfway up a mountain, etc., etc. There's nothing really there you wouldn't expect, apart from a couple of things. First of all, and this is possibly quite surprising, nobody really mentioned technology. They certainly didn't mention digital technology or screens. Quite a lot of people sort of mentioned other forms of technology, newspapers, magazines, books, pencils. I mean, this research was done a few years ago, and it'd be interesting to do it again, because I think with what's been going on with Kindles and iPads and smartphones, maybe that's changed a little bit, but I doubt whether it's changed very, very much. A significant proportion of the activities that people cited involved relative degree of solitude, which was pretty interesting, and a relative degree of silence. It seemed that people literally couldn't hear themselves think in noisy, busy offices. They had to get away from the office to some extent. And it seems that in this sort of age we've got now of multitasking and crowdsourced intelligent and 24/7 access to just about anything we want, ranging from a newspaper to fish and chips, it seems to appear that doing nothing, and I mean really nothing, or what appears to other people to be nothing, is vastly, vastly, vastly underrated. And I'm sure you've had a long day. I'm 5 minutes under, but I think it might be quite a good idea if we retired to the bar and had to think about this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. Great stuff. Thank you, Richard. OK, so we've got time for a couple of questions. Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask Richard? Again, I can't see a thing, but except for this gentleman here who's holding his hand up. Hold on, I think the microphone's coming. We'll get you some technology.
As a young man, when I was studying architecture, the head of school there said, you've got to learn to waste time productively. I now see what he means.
Amen to that.
Very good. Anybody else here with a question for Richard? No? One gentleman here.
thought it was fascinating, Richard. I run a small company of about 15 people, and one of the things we're trying to figure out is what's the optimal week to get the most done and have the most fun. Any insights there?
That's a good one. I think, number one, avoid routine. Mix it up. Go and do strange things. It's very easy to get into a rut. We get home, we watch the same TV programs, we get up in the morning, we read the same newspaper, we go to work in the same way, the same route, we sit in the same place. We're kind of doing the same thing the entire time. And if you dig into how the brain works, the brain's really lazy. It's into energy conservation. So it'll take the shortest route to do anything. And the key to actually sort of unlocking the brain's potential, I think, is to interrupt it with unusual stuff. You need really diverse inputs. You also need changes of pace. There's nothing wrong with fast, but slow's good too. There's nothing wrong with an office, but get out of the office as well. There's a company I used to sort of be involved with, and they used to just literally change where everyone sat every so often. So one minute you're sitting next to the intern, the next minute it's a finance director, the next minute it's somebody from accounts, and that was kind of interesting. And you had interesting conversations. You have to get people to physically move. And I think virtualization, digitalization is wonderful on so many levels, but I am a total cynic about whether you can do things entirely virtually. I think you need people to be in a physical space and critically to bump into each other accidentally and to have accidental serendipitous conversations, which is why things like kitchens are so damned important. Staircases are really, really important. And, architects are onto this big time, but the more can be done. Talking to people from other professions, talking to older people, younger people. I think the fun point is actually important. The trouble is that when it comes to office design, in my experience, the fun thing is the brainstorming room that has really thick felt pens, some crazy hats, and some big colour bean bags, which is kind of kindergarten. And it's actually a bit off-putting from my point of view. I think there are other ways you can actually sort of have some fun. I think email is dangerous. So it's interesting, there's a CEO of Atos Origin. He was the ex-CEO of France Telecom, and he's really into the idea that in about 5 years' time, he doesn't want anyone in the office using email. Now, I think he's deluded. That's not going to happen. But I think if you could just get rid of some email, maybe Fridays you don't email. So instead of dress down Fridays, that's the no email day or something. If somebody's down the corridor, for God's sake, don't email them. Go and see them, The physical thing, and we are fundamentally a social species, and ideas are social. Ideas need to bump into other ideas, and then they can have sex and you get new ideas. That's how it works. And online is great, I think, for polishing, for refining, for evolving. It's also great if you have an extraordinarily defined problem, well-defined problem. Online is great for ideas, but if it's actually the initial thing, that sort of eureka moment, I think technology is 50 years behind some old ideas like going out to lunch and opening a bottle of wine.
Okay, well, I think on that note, ideas are social.
Thank you.
We're going to say thank you very much to Richard. Richard Watson.